Hi, this is James Cook, Assistant Professor of Social Science at the University of Maine at Augusta, and this video is a review of some ideas of the sociology of culture for an introduction to sociology class. So what is culture? Well, that's a big question, but really it's a set of beliefs, norms, practices, um, and signifiers of all of those in materials that are shared by a social group. So now let's start with beliefs because that's perhaps the easiest. But there are really two kinds of belief that are cultural. We can have beliefs about what we think is true. Now that can be actually true or it could be actually false. The belief of that truth still has cultural power, and that's what the Thomas theorem um, says. It says that when we believe something to be real, it is real in its consequences. Here's an example. Have you ever heard of the belief that if you go swimming when you had something to eat too soon, you'll get a stomach cramp? Well, it turns out that's not really actually factually true. But it's culturally true, and so for generations, the kids have not gone into the swimming pool uh, after having eaten a meal. They've had to wait for 20 minutes to digest because they don't want them to get a cramp. So there's the power of a cultural belief about what is actually true, or what we believe to be actually true. Then there's a second kind of belief. It's a belief about what we believe to be morally proper versus improper, morally good or bad. These are also called values. That we value certain things and we do not value others. Maybe we value certain religions and we don't value others. Maybe we value certain sports teams and we don't value others. Maybe we value certain practices, shaking hands, in some places but not in others. It's considered a norm, which is a basic rule of practice of behavior, to shake hands when you meet someone on the street or in a party. But when you are in a hospital, it is actually not a norm to shake hands because that might spread germs. So, we have norms, they reflect our values, and they're about beliefs and practices. Now, another part of our culture involves material objects that we create. The material, meaning physical. This could be a tool. It could be a piece of clothing. It could be a statue in a square, right? A monument to the things we care about. Look in a town and see what they value. Look for it in their sculptures, in their statues. Look for it in clothes. What does this tie signify, right? It signifies that I am a professional worker. Particularly, I'm a professor. But I could be any kind of professional worker if I'm wearing this tie. And I am signifying to you, I'm putting this out like a sign, the idea that I would like you to behave in a certain way toward me, and you can expect me to behave in a certain way toward you. Then that is distinct from non-material culture, which is a set of ideas, a set of words, things that are not tangible, things we can't touch, but that reflect our beliefs, reflect our norms and our values and our behaviors. So here's an idea about culture that Anne Swidler came up with. The idea is that it's not something that just happens to us, but that it's something that we do something with. Culture is a toolkit, right? Imagine you have a set of tools, right? Sometimes you need a screwdriver, sometimes you need a hammer, and if there's a job that you need to do and you don't have the right tool, well, the job's just not going to get done, or it's going to get done really badly. A cultural toolkit can be like that. This tie is part of my cultural toolkit. If in my videos I was wearing a sweatshirt with stains on it, and believe me, I've got those, would you react to me in the same way? My tone of voice involves a particular cultural toolkit. If I talk like this to my spouse, would she appreciate that? No, because it's not culturally appropriate. But it is culturally appropriate for me to be lecturing you. And that's part of the set of academic cultural toolkits that we have. If I don't have a tool in my toolkit, I may have trouble. And so this becomes an issue for first-generation college students. First generation meaning they don't have anyone in their family who's been to college or to a university, and they don't know what to expect. They don't know, am I supposed to raise my hand in class? I don't know, am I supposed to approach the teacher after class? What am I supposed to do? I don't know. I don't have that cultural element at the ready for me. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. I don't know what the practice is. And so I'm going to have a difficult time. This may describe you, and the fact that you are persevering in the face of that cultural disadvantage is a testament to your perseverance. And eventually you'll get it. You'll get that tool, and you can put it in your toolkit, and you can use it for the rest of your life. The culture is maybe not just a toolkit, but it's a sign. Remember I said a tie signifies, like a sign, like a traffic sign. Hey, this is where I want you to go. This is what I want you to do. There are so many signifiers. A haircut can signify what kind of social class a person fits in, and what you can expect them to say or not to say. Hair color can do that. Presence of tattoos. It's a literal sign, but it can also be a signifier. And people can interpret that sign in different ways. Some ways in a way that they would rather not be interpreted as. Other people may interpret a tattoo to mean something that it didn't intend. Culture can be ambiguous. This is an idea of a field called semiotics. It tells us what we ought to pay attention to, what we ought to participate in. It says what we ought to believe in, what we ought to venerate. Right? When you see at a sports ceremony the raising of an American flag, and you see people stand up, those are signifiers for a certain behavior that's about to happen, which is a Pledge of Allegiance. Conversely, these signifiers also tell us what we're not supposed to be doing, what we're supposed to be avoiding, what we're supposed to be denying, and sometimes what we ought to be despising. There can be negative emotions and expressions associated with culture as well. So, culture involves a lot of variation. There's variation within societies as well as across societies, and I want to show you that in just a moment. What is seemingly normal in one society may not be in another. And even within one society, there can be these subcultures, right? These elements of a culture that are somewhat different. If you think about it, everything I'm telling you right now, including the whole notion of culture, is also itself part of a cultural belief. It's a concept. It's not like culture existed at the beginning of the universe and it's just been waiting for human beings to come along. No, people made up this idea. Why? Because it's useful. It's a tool that we sociologists use to understand the behavior that's around us. Culture becomes real when we understand the idea of culture and accept it and act accordingly as sociologists. Okay? So, it is something that is created by humans, and we can discover differences across space and across time. What culture does not mean for sociologists is what some people use the word culture to mean, which is high class. Oh, well, you're going to get yourself some culture. Can mean in some contexts, oh, you're going to the opera, or oh, you're going to the Philharmonic Orchestra, or oh, you're going to the Museum of Fine Arts. All these high class, high income, high investment forms of music, fine arts, and humanities that are actually expensive and that denote some kind of high status can have the word culture. But that's an old sense of culture, this notion that people who are high class, who have a lot of money, are the people who have culture and everyone else doesn't. Sociologists have long since figured out everyone has culture. Our cultures vary. And that's what's important to note. there's a notion about cultural universals that is out there. There are some social institutions, social practices, and social values that are found almost everywhere. Music is one. In just about every society, people value music. And this practice of creating music through singing or chanting through some instrument. Language is another one, and it is something that is valued. Marriage, a permanent bond between a couple. Art, people do it everywhere. These are cultural universals. They're complicated, they signify meaning, and we find them everywhere. But not everything cultural is a universal. And so I asked you at the beginning of the semester, or in the last week, to fill out a survey in which you did a word association. When I say a word, what do you say? And I want to show you the results of all the words that at least 2 people said. So, for example, when we look at the word blue, what do you say? Well, 28 of you said sky, and 23 of you said something about the water, either water itself or typically ocean. That's a high consensus in just those 2 items. It's not a cultural universal to associate blue with sky or blue with water. You do diverge. But I want to show you that there's a number of actual blue things that you don't mention. Only 2 of you mentioned berries. Okay? I don't see the word jeans here. There are blue jeans all over the place, right? Blue ribbon, no ribbon. There are all kinds of blue things that you don't think to mention because we have this cultural association of blue with the sky and water, even though water is not always blue, and the sky is not always blue. If there's a snowstorm outside, it's definitely not blue. We think of it, though, as blue. When you take a crayon, when you're a kid, and you're going to draw the sky, what color is it going to be? It's blue, even though often it is gray, even though the water is often brown or murky, dark green. All kinds of colors it can be. For us, the water is always blue, and that is cultural. It doesn't have to be true to be culturally appropriate. Now, this association with blue can change from place to place, and I want to show you that by loading up a browser and looking at a tool online called Google Trends. Well, here we are. It's google.com/trends, and it's an index of the searches that people engage in over time and over places. So I want to enter a few terms. Blue jeans, blue lobster, blue devils. If we're going to keep moving on the subject of what's blue, let's enter the search term for that. Now it's going to show us the trends in search results, and I want to look down within the United States and I want to see what kind of variation there is. Now there's a map here, and in this map darker colors indicate a higher stress on that term in searches. People search for it more. People search for blue jeans most in Massachusetts, but there's not a really strong divergence compared to blue lobster. The idea of blue lobster and the rare blue lobster is this concern mainly of New Hampshire and Maine. That is a cultural element that is highly regional compared to blue jeans, which is pretty universal. What about blue devils? Oh, look at that. North Carolina and the Dakotas as well. I'd be interested to find out culturally how that relates to the Dakotas. But North Carolina has a high concentration of searches for blue devils. Why? Because there's a sports team. and it has to do with Blue Devils. Again, use Google Trends to look at cultural differences over space. And you can find a lot of areas of cultural divergence. People don't talk about Blue Devils up in Maine. So, let's think about another word. What about the word hop? Okay. Well, most folks here either included bunny or rabbit. 45. That's a lot more consensus than there was for the word blue. Bunny. But there are other places and other times where hip would be the top. Other places and other states where I've taught. Hip becomes a thing you think about with hopping. Some people thought about hopscotch and jumping, this physical activity. And that is literally something that someone can do. No one put in the word sock, as in a sock hop, right? That's an idea from the 1950s. It's a piece of culture that has essentially gone away. It is not something that we think of as related to a hop anymore. Okay. What about success? What is it that leads to success? A lot of different things. Here is a piece in which UMA's culture diverges. It's very diverse. Some people say work is what gives you happiness or success, excuse me. Other people say happiness is a sign of success. You're successful if you're happy in what you're doing. What about completion, getting done? College and graduation, many of you are thinking about. Other people are saying, well, there's happiness, there's pride, but money. Money is an indicator of success for some people. Okay. So this is an area about which the culture does not have a consensus. What about united? A strong level of consensus under states. Really interesting. You know why? Because when I did this survey 10 years ago, just a few years after 9/11, there was a word, a phrase actually, that people used, and it was far and away the most popular. It was "we stand." Do you remember that phrase? United we stand. You remember the bumper stickers that were everywhere? United we stand. It was this phrase, and now it's been largely forgotten. It was a cultural moment that receded. There are a lot of other ideas about United, right? United Airlines, United Kingdom, but most people immediately said states. Finally, I wanted to note the large number of items regarding the concept real Maine. There's a concern within the state of Maine. You'll hear people say it every now and again. Oh, yeah, well, you want the real Maine? I'll show you the real Maine. Or, that's not real Maine. What is the real Maine? Right? If there were 84 people who were answering this quiz, this survey, and look, of those that have at least two answers, excuse me, it's not a large number of people. So if we total that up, that's 16, 20, 27, 33, 35, 37, 39, 41. That means there are 43 other terms that only one person mentioned. It's a huge disagreement about what the real Maine is. And yet at the same time, if you listen, there's a lot of concern that's discussed in the newspapers, it's discussed in personal conversation within our state about what real Maine is. That this is real Maine and that is not real Maine. Well, we can't agree about what is real culturally about Maine. Now, to look at this in a little bit more detail, I'd like us to think not about how people write about real Maine in, say, a newspaper or a piece of media, but in social media. There's a social media website called Twitter in which people can post text messages of up to 140 characters. And you can search through this very public record for words or for phrases, including real Maine. Let's go do that. So here we are in Twitter. I have searched for the phrase real Maine, and let's look at all results. And we can see what people say. 3 lines down, we see someone who has posted real Maine women use shovels instead of snowblowers. That is, look, that's culture. What is that? That's a value right there. That is saying this is what we value. Here in Maine, we do it ourselves with shovels. We don't need any snowblowers. That is a statement of a cultural value, clear as day. Someone says, I want a real Maine or New England blizzard with lots of D's. What does that mean? A real Maine blizzard would have a lot of snow. This is a belief about the way Maine really is, right? That there's this kind of lame blizzard, and then there's a real Maine blizzard. That Maine, when it has blizzards, it's going to have a really big blizzard. Okay, so then down toward the bottom, there's someone who is talking about, my Maine studies professor considers beaches and bean boots to be stereotypical Maine. Ha! What a joke. Let me show you the real Maine. So here's someone saying, I reject this professor's notion of what real Maine is. I know what real Maine is. I can show you what that real Maine is. And then finally, we've got some commercial culture. We have a Twitter account called Real Maine Weddings. And the idea of real Maine weddings is that you can go out and you can have lupins in a garden and you can get married outside, and there's something Maine about it. Something Maine about it. Something Maine about clam chowder, right? Oh, except it's made in Oregon. There's a problem. So here's someone, Too Ticky, whoever that is, who is noticing that culture can move from place to place. So it's a Maine clam chowder that's been made in Oregon, which is a bit of a problem. Then, if you check it out, there are a few entries here that use the words real Maine, but not to refer to the state of Maine at all. It's a completely different cultural element. Seems so unreal Maine means, hey, it seems so unreal. If we go up to the top, the turnip is real Maine. That's when shit gets real Maine. This is a completely different element, culturally speaking, for the expression of exactly the same words. It means something entirely different, and perhaps something unexpected. So, we've talked about culture being something that can shift over space, but culture can also shift over time. And Alan Taylor has done a great example of visual sociology by, on his Flickr account, comparing and contrasting a 1963 version of a book for toddlers called Richard Scarry's Best Word Book Ever, and then his current 1991 version. And there are a lot of differences about the depiction of men and women, what women should be, what men should be, what women should do, what men should do. Let's take a look at some of them. In 1963, the bear comes promptly when he is called to breakfast. In 1991, they changed it. He goes to the kitchen to eat his breakfast. It's not clear that someone's making the breakfast for him anymore. Now, in order to make a revision, right, they're not going to do it unless they feel it's really called for. So this is a recognition that there has been a change in our cultural values regarding gender, how we think of men and women and how they relate to one another. In 1963, well, he will have his breakfast made for him. Not in 1991, not necessarily. In 1963, in the kitchen, there's a mother. In 1991, there is a mother and there is a father. And someone's gone to the trouble of actually changing the picture. That takes work, it's trouble, there has to be a good reason to do it, and the reason they did it is because the culture changed, a culture shift. Wow, well, so we might say, hey, isn't it great we live in an enlightened time where we have a more accurate view of gender, and it's more realistic? That's not necessarily safe to say. Although certainly our gender ideas always feel real at the time. It feels like that's the way it's supposed to be. It's not necessarily more accurate. In fact, it can be even more inaccurate. You may ask yourself, in 30 years from now, how are people going to look at the books of the 2000 teens? What will they say? How will they ridicule it? How will they ridicule movies of today? If you take a look at Snow White, and you take a look at the depiction of women in Snow White, and I have a few links here if you want to follow them so that you can look at it yourself. There's a blog, a sociological blog, that says if you look at Snow White, she looks actually fairly realistic for a feminine character. Her nose is a little off, but she doesn't have crazy whacked out bodily proportions. She has a kind of a meaty wrist, if you look at that. If you look at the hand of the man, it's bigger than the woman's in this picture, Prince Charming and Snow White, but not by that much. If you look at their heads, they're about the same size, about. There is very little dimorphism in gender according to these two characters. Dimorphism means that the two different genders have different forms. They're pretty similar. Compare that to a more recent, modern-day movie, Beauty and the Beast. Within our generation, take a look at the size of the man's head. Take a look at the size of the female character's head. Take a look at his hands. Take a look at her hands. You could fit her head in his hands. So the folks who are running Sociological Images, a blog that looks at this kind of change over time, have found a lot of differences. And more recent Disney movies are not necessarily more realistic, more accurate. There's a stronger cultural idea. Look at the difference in the size between their eyes. His eyes are small, her eyes are big. Impossibly big. If you met someone on the street with eyes that big, you might turn and run the other way. You might be scared. Because it's not realistic. It's not accurate. Instead, it's depicting an idea of a form that should be aspired to, that's believed to be feminine. One that is really unattainable. And an idea of masculinity that is almost unattainable as well. I mean, look at the size of his bicep. It is the size of her head. Have you ever met anyone with a bicep the size of someone's head? It is rarely, if ever, will you find that, right? There's either a problem with the bicep or the problem with the head. And yet, it's telling a story here. It's telling us what we should culturally value. Finally, here's a most recent Disney film, Frozen, and we have a blog post by a sociologist who is saying, my goodness, my eyeball is bigger than my wrist. And to show this, they went and actually cut out the graphic of the character's eyeball, placed it on the wrist. It's bigger than her wrist. So this is an increase in sexual dimorphism to absurd ends, right? Absolutely absurd ends. And in recent times, our culture can be just as absurd as the culture of 30, 40 years ago when it comes to gender.